Good afternoon and welcome to Tuesday, June 9th's Daily Reflection. Let me start by saying that I am, or I was, a huge fan of Peanuts, the comic strip created by Charles Schulz. Even had the opportunity to meet Mr. Schulz a couple of times when we lived in Santa Rosa. He had an ice rink there, and he was famous for being there every day at lunchtime for a grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup. But here's the story that I didn't know about until yesterday. On July 31st, 1968, a young black man was reading the newspaper when he saw something he had never seen before. With tears in his eyes, he started running and screaming around the house, calling for his mom. She would show his mom, and she would gasp, seeing something she thought she would never see in her lifetime. And throughout the nation, there were similar reactions. It was indeed the first time they saw Franklin Armstrong's first appearance in the iconic comic strip Peanuts. That would make Franklin 52 years old this July. Franklin was born after a school teacher, Harriet Glickman, had written a letter to Charles Schulz after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated outside his Memphis hotel room. Glickman, who is said to have had kids of her own and having worked with kids, was especially aware of the power of comics among the young. Quote, "And my feeling at the time was that I realized that black kids and white kids never saw themselves depicted together in a classroom," unquote. So she wrote. Here's part of the letter to Mr. Schulz. "Since the death of Martin Luther King, I've been asking myself, what can I do to help change those conditions in our society which led to the assassination and which contribute to the vast sea of misunderstanding, hate, fear, and violence?" Glickman asked Schulz if he would consider adding a black character to his popular comic strip, which he hoped would bring the country together and show people of color that they were not excluded from American society. She said she had written to others as well, but others feared it was too soon, or that it might be too costly for their careers, that the syndicate that provided their comic strips would drop them if they dared do something like that. Charles Schulz didn't have to respond to the letter. He could have completely ignored it, and everyone would have forgotten about it. But Schulz, like I know he would, took time to respond, saying that he was intrigued with the idea. But he wasn't sure whether it would be right coming from him. He didn't want to make matters worse, and he felt that it might sound condescending to people of color. Glickman didn't give up. She continued communicating with Schulz, and Schulz surprisingly responded each and every time. She even had some of her black friends write to Schulz and explain to him what it would mean to them and give him some suggestions on how to introduce the character without offending anyone. The conversation continued until one day Schulz would tell Glickman to check her newspaper on July 31st, 1968. On that date, the cartoon, as created by Charles Schulz, showed Charlie Brown meeting a new character named Franklin. Other than his color, Franklin was just an ordinary kid who befriends and helps Charlie Brown. Franklin also mentioned that his father was, quote, over at Vietnam, and at the end of the series, which lasted 3 strips, Charlie invited Franklin to spend the night one day so they could continue their friendship. I just thought this was good reintroduction of Franklin to the rest of the world. I'm very glad to know you. There was no big announcement. There was no big deal. It was just a natural conversation between 2 kids whose obvious differences didn't matter to them. And the fact that Franklin's father was fighting for this country was also a strong statement by Schulz. Although Schulz never made a big deal over the inclusion of Franklin, there were many fans, more unfortunately in the South, who were very upset by it and made national news because of it. One Southern editor even is quoted as saying, "I don't mind you having a black character, but please don't show them in school together." This would all eventually lead to a conversation between Charles Schulz and the president of the Comics Distribution Company, who was concerned about the introduction of Franklin and how it might affect Schulz's popularity. Newspapers during the time had threatened to cut the strip. Sparky, as he was known affectionately in Santa Rosa, responded, quote, "I remember telling Larry at the time about Franklin. He wanted me to change it. And we talked about it for a long while on the phone. I finally sighed and said, well, Larry, let's put it this way. Either you print it just the way I draw it, or I quit. How's that?" Those of us who are fans of Peanuts know that Franklin became a regular character in the comic strip. And despite complaints, Franklin would be shown sitting in front of Peppermint Patty at school and playing center field for her baseball team. Now, there were some moments, and most of them on the TV shows, that Franklin would appear separate or alone or away from everybody else. But please know, that was not Charles Schulz's plan, and he had no control over what happened on the TV series. But he did have control over his own comic strip, and he courageously decided to make a statement because of one brave school teacher who decided to ask a simple question. Glickman would explain later that her parents were concerned about about others and the values they instilled in us about caring for and appreciating everyone of all colors and backgrounds. This is what we know when we are growing up, that you cared about other people, and do so during the years they were very aware of the issues of racism and civil rights in the country back in the 60s and 70s, when those of us who were around knew that people of color weren't able to sit in the same places. Black people in the South and in the North not able to sit in the front of the bus, not be able to sit at the same seats in the restaurants. Every day we would see or read about black children not being able to get into school, seeing crowds of white people standing around being ugly. But because of Glickman, because of Charles Schulz, people around the world were introduced to a little boy named Franklin. Oh, it's that quiet leadership of Charles Schulz. How I miss him. How I thank God for his courage and willingness to push the boundaries. In his own way, he changed the world. I look forward to seeing you again on Sunday. Remember that the Reopen Task Force meets on Thursday. If you haven't finished the survey, please do so quickly. And if you can email it, great. If you need to deliver it, please do so tomorrow afternoon at the latest. Also, please remember, wash those hands 20 seconds at a time, a couple of times a day. Use hand lotion. Joan tells me it keeps your hands soft and gentle. Stay home if you're sick. Practice the important physical distancing, 6 feet apart. Wear your masks. Don't get too frustrated and upset with everything else seemingly opening and the fear of what might happen. And of course, as Sergeant Esterhaus dismisses me and you and everybody else that I know each day for our tasks, he reminds us to be careful out there.